Across Europe, water restrictions, parched fields, and shrinking river flows are appearing again. While official data shows water scarcity has touched 28% of European Union territory in at least one season. That number sounds almost manageable on paper. It is not half the continent. It is not the language of collapse. It can be placed inside a chart, softened by a yearly average, and treated like a regional inconvenience. But outside the chart, 28% becomes irrigation canals running low when crops need water most. It becomes small towns watching reservoirs fall. It becomes hotels, farms, power plants, and households quietly reaching for the same limited supply at the same dry moment. But that is not the most frightening part. The deeper warning is that Europe does not have to become a desert to enter a water crisis. A continent can still receive rain, still have rivers, still look blue on a map, and still fail locally because the water arrives in the wrong season, in the wrong place, or in a storm too violent for the soil to keep. So what does Europe's water stress really reveal about the future? Not whether there is water somewhere, but whether systems built for an older climate can deliver it where life actually depends on it. Viewers who want this investigation to continue can like, subscribe, and comment with the place where they are watching from. On a summer morning in southern Europe, the crisis does not always arrive like a disaster. It may arrive through a municipal announcement, a restriction on watering gardens, a warning that swimming pools cannot be refilled, or a notice to farmers that irrigation turns will be reduced. It arrives through a farmer walking between rows of young plants and seeing not flames, not floodwater, not a spectacular ruin, but leaves that have begun to curl at the edges because the soil below them has become a bank account with too many withdrawals and too little deposit. It arrives through a hotel manager checking reservations while checking reservoir levels. It arrives through a family in an apartment block being told to limit non-essential use, while a few kilometers away, tourist demand keeps rising because the heat that dries the landscape also brings people to beaches, resorts, and cities. It arrives through a river that still exists, still has water in it, still reflects bridges and church towers, but runs lower than the system around it expected. That is why this story is not only about drought, it is about the hidden geography of shortage. Europe's water stress looks small when averaged across countries and years, because the continent is not uniformly dry. Some regions flood, while others run short. Some months are wet, while the growing season is dry. Some basins appear stable annually, while one critical quarter pushes demand beyond renewable supply. The map becomes less reassuring the closer it is examined. The European Environment Agency uses a measure called the Water Exploitation Index Plus, a technical phrase that sounds dull until it is translated into a question every society understands. How much water is being consumed compared with how much renewable fresh water is available in a specific place and season. When that ratio rises above 20%, the agency considers water resources under stress. Above 40%, the stress is severe and use may become unsustainable. The critical detail is not just the threshold, it is the scale. The index can be calculated by season and by river basin, not only by country or year. That means it can reveal the thing annual averages hide. A country may look safe on paper, while one basin, in one quarter, crosses into stress. A continent may look water-rich, while the exact landscape that feeds a city, a crop, a power plant, or a wetland becomes strained at the worst possible moment. This is the first overlooked fact. Water security is not a national average. It is a delivery problem. It has to reach the right place, in the right form, at the right time. A mountain snowpack that melts too early is not the same as summer river flow. A violent rainstorm after a dry spell is not the same as slow groundwater recharge. A reservoir that looks adequate in spring may become fragile by late summer if demand surges, rainfall fails, and evaporation accelerates under heat. This is why Europe can be both wet and stressed, flooded and thirsty, blue on a map and brown in the root zone. The people most directly affected are not abstract consumers. They are farmers who depend on a narrow planting window. They are elderly residents whose health depends on clean water, cool rooms, and functioning public services during heat. They are households in rural areas relying on wells that may be more vulnerable than urban supply networks. They are workers in tourism regions where seasonal population can swell just as rainfall declines. They are communities downstream from reservoirs where every decision creates a conflict. Release water for ecology, hold water for drinking supply, divert water for crops, keep enough flow for navigation, or protect hydroelectric production. They are also taxpayers and ratepayers in cities that assumed water infrastructure was a quiet background system. The pipe beneath the road, the treatment plant beyond the edge of town, the aquifer nobody sees, the reservoir behind a ridge, the pumping station behind a fence. These become visible only when they begin to strain. Official warnings increasingly describe this not as a distant concern, but as a present and expanding pressure. The European Commission has framed droughts and water scarcity as a challenge to the resilience of the whole water cycle, from source to sea. The European Environment Agency has warned that freshwater resources are essential for health, nature, economies, and societies, yet are threatened by multiple pressures. Copernicus climate monitoring has shown that recent dry conditions have not been confined to the Mediterranean imagination of drought. Large parts of Europe have seen drier than average soil moisture, below average precipitation, or low river flows. The Joint Research Centre has described drought conditions affecting large parts of Central and Northern Europe, with low river discharge detected in Eastern Europe, the Baltic region, and parts of Turkey, and with vegetation impacts emerging. These are not isolated fragments. They are pieces of a pattern. Water scarcity no longer respects the mental map that places drought only at the continent's southern edge. That is why a viewer in Berlin, Warsaw, Amsterdam, Paris, Milan, Barcelona, Athens, Bucharest, Copenhagen, Dublin, or London should care. The issue is not whether every place will face the same shortage. It will not. The issue is that the old assumptions behind water planning are being tested in more places, more often, with sharper seasonal contrasts. The system is built around expectations: how much rain arrives in winter, how snowpack melts in spring, how soil holds moisture, how rivers behave in summer, how much demand cities and farms place on supply, how fast restrictions can be imposed, how politically acceptable conservation becomes. When those expectations shift together, shortage can appear before the public has emotionally accepted that a crisis is underway. That is what makes water stress dangerous. It can be quiet until it is not. It can accumulate underground, inside aquifers, in depleted soil moisture, behind reservoir gauges, inside political delays, until one dry season turns a manageable imbalance into a public emergency. On paper, 28% of territory sounds like a fraction. In lived reality, it can mean a whole basin entering the season with a deficit. It can mean the farmer's calendar no longer matches the climate. It can mean a city's backup plan assumes neighboring regions have spare water, only to find that neighboring regions are stressed too. It can mean a river that must serve agriculture, drinking water, energy, industry, transport, recreation, ecosystems, and tourism at once. Water is unusual because every sector calls it essential. During shortage, that word becomes a conflict. The same cubic meter cannot be simultaneously in a canal, a tap, a cooling system, a wetland, a navigation channel, and a vineyard. The system begins to reveal priorities that were hidden when water was abundant enough to avoid hard choices. The headline number is powerful because it is both large and easy to underestimate. According to the European Environment Agency, water scarcity conditions affected 28% of EU land area and 32% of the EU population in at least 1/4 of the year in 2023. The agency also notes that, on average, about 30% of EU territory and about 1/3 of the population are affected each year by seasonal water scarcity conditions. 1/3 of the population is not an edge case. It is not a footnote. It is tens of millions of people living in places where, for at least part of the year, water use and renewable supply come too close for comfort. The number becomes more striking when converted into a household image. Imagine a large apartment building where the landlord says there is enough water for the year, but every afternoon in summer, 1/3 of the residents may experience pressure drops because too many taps open at once and the tank refills too slowly. The annual report would say the building used less water than it received. The people on the upper floors would still know the truth. Water stress is often an upper floor problem. It is not only about total volume, it is about pressure, timing, elevation, storage, and demand peaks. The same logic applies to river basins. The system can look adequate over a year, but fail during the quarter that matters. Agriculture makes this especially clear. A crop does not need water in the abstract. It needs water when the seed germinates, when roots expand, when heat arrives, when fruit forms, when grain fills. Miss that window, and rain later may help the landscape, but not recover the lost yield. A vineyard stressed at the wrong moment may survive but produce less. A maize field may look green until the heatwave arrives, and the soil profile is already depleted. An orchard cannot simply pause its biological clock until reservoirs recover. The hidden weakness is the crop window, the narrow period when water is not optional. Once that window closes, the damage moves from soil into plants, from plants into harvest, from harvest into farm income, from income into debt, prices, employment, and food supply chains. This is how a climate signal becomes an economic signal. It passes through roots. Cities have their own windows. Urban water demand often peaks during hot, dry periods, precisely when rivers are low and reservoirs are falling. People shower more, parks need watering, cooling systems work harder, leaks become more costly, and tourists may add temporary population to regions designed for a quieter baseline. Public supply is usually protected before other uses, but that protection does not make it effortless. It may require emergency transfers, restrictions on non-essential use, deeper pumping, higher treatment costs, or conflict with farmers and ecosystems. In some places, the fragile component is not the reservoir, but the pipe network. Leakage in water supply systems turns scarcity into a self-inflicted wound. A city can ask households to save water while losing large volumes through aging pipes before the water ever reaches a tap. The public may experience conservation as a personal burden, while the infrastructure itself leaks the trust out of the system. In other places, the weak point is groundwater. Aquifers are often treated as savings accounts, but they can be slow to recharge and easy to overdraw. Groundwater hides crisis because it is underground. A reservoir shows its falling shoreline. A river exposes gravel bars. An aquifer can decline silently until wells need to be deepened. Pumping costs rise, springs weaken. Wetlands dry, or saltwater intrudes into coastal groundwater. The delay creates a dangerous illusion. People may believe there is still time because water still comes from the tap, even as the invisible reserve that supports the tap is shrinking. That is why water stress cannot be judged only by whether a household has running water today. The question is, what hidden reserves are being consumed to keep that normality intact? The headline also hides a paradox in progress. The European Environment Agency reports that total water abstraction in the EU has declined over the long term, compared with the beginning of the century, partly because of changes in electricity cooling. That sounds like success. And in some ways it is. Efficiency matters. Industrial change matters. Reduced abstraction matters. But the same agency has warned that there has been no overall reduction in the area affected by water scarcity conditions. This is the unsettling part. Europe can use water more efficiently and still see local stress persist or worsen because supply is changing, demand is concentrated, and climate pressure is intensifying seasonal extremes. Efficiency alone does not guarantee resilience if the hydrological baseline is moving underneath the system. A boat can become lighter and still run aground if the river falls faster than the boat is redesigned. The numbers also change meaning by sector. The EU abstracts roughly 200,000 million cubic meters of water annually, excluding hydropower. Power plant cooling, agriculture, public supply, and industry are major users. Some water uses return much of the water, while others consume more through evaporation, plant growth, or incorporation into products. But during shortage, even non-consumptive use can matter because timing and temperature matter. A power plant may return water, but if the river is already low and warm, ecological limits and cooling constraints can become real. Agriculture may be the most visible battlefield because irrigation is spatially concentrated and seasonally intense. Public supply may be politically prioritized because no government wants taps running dry. Tourism can act like a seasonal multiplier, adding demand where summer water is already most fragile. Each sector sees its own necessity. The river sees only withdrawals, returns, temperatures, and flows. This is why the phrase water stress looks smaller than the reality. It compresses many different vulnerabilities into one measurement. It can describe a basin where agriculture is the pressure. It can describe a coastal region where tourism pushes summer demand beyond comfortable supply. It can describe an urban area where dense population and public supply are the issue. It can describe a river system where low flow affects navigation, ecology, and cooling. A single index can open the door, but the story is in the mechanism, and the mechanism begins with timing. The overlooked truth is this: Europe's water problem is not simply that there is too little water. It is that the water cycle is becoming less useful to the systems built around it. More intense rain can fall too quickly to recharge groundwater. Warmer winters can reduce snow storage. Earlier snowmelt can shift water away from summer needs. Longer dry spells can harden soil, weaken infiltration, and increase runoff when rain finally returns. Higher temperatures can pull more moisture out of land and vegetation through evaporation and transpiration. This creates a strange future in which both flood and drought risk can rise in the same region, because the issue is not only volume, but distribution. The atmosphere can carry more moisture in a warmer world, but that does not mean every field receives gentle rain at the right moment. A warmer atmosphere can intensify downpours, but a downpour after a long dry spell may behave less like a refill and more like an assault. It hits compacted or dry soil, runs off roads and fields, overloads drains, erodes slopes, floods towns, and leaves groundwater still under-recharged. A person watching muddy floodwater in a street may think the drought is over. A hydrologist may look at the same scene and ask how much of that water actually entered the aquifer. The answer is often less than the public imagines. The water was present, but not stored. It passed through the system like money through fingers. That is the difference between wet weather and water security. A storm is an event. Security is storage, infiltration, timing, quality, and governance. The mechanism has a name in practice, even if different agencies describe it through different indicators. Seasonal amplification of water stress. A small annual imbalance becomes a serious seasonal shortage when climate, demand, soil, infrastructure, and governance line up in the wrong direction. The atmosphere begins the chain. A persistent high-pressure system can block rain-bearing weather patterns, allowing sunlight and heat to dry the land for weeks. Wind can increase evaporation. Warm nights prevent the landscape from cooling and conserving moisture. Soil moisture declines first near the surface, then deeper into the root zone. The root zone matters because it is the part of the soil plants actually use. A field can receive a short shower and look refreshed at the surface, while deeper roots remain in dry ground. Crop stress begins before dramatic failure. Leaves close pores to reduce water loss. Growth slows. Pollination suffers. Yield potential falls. Farmers respond by irrigating if water is available. If many farmers irrigate at once, withdrawals rise during the very period when rivers and aquifers are weakest. The shortage then moves from meteorology into management. Who gets water first? Who pays more? Which crop is saved? Which field is abandoned? The same mechanism enters a city differently. Heat increases demand. Reservoir levels decline. Water utilities, Monitor inflows and storage. If a dry spring follows a dry winter, the city enters summer with less margin. If leakage is high, every restriction imposed on citizens feels more bitter. If the city depends on a distant basin, it becomes vulnerable to conditions outside its political boundary. If the region also hosts tourists, the population served by the network may exceed the population listed in ordinary planning documents. A dry month then becomes more than a dry month. It becomes a stress test of pipes, reservoirs, treatment plants, legal rights, emergency communication, and public trust. The weak component may be small: a pump station, a leak-prone main, a reservoir intake exposed by low water, a treatment plant facing poorer raw water quality, a local council hesitant to impose restrictions until the deficit is obvious, a warning system that informs agencies but not households in time to change behavior. System failure often begins in these small pieces, not in dramatic continental collapse. That is why this story must resist a simple image of Europe turning into desert. That image is false and too easy. The more accurate image is a map whose blue areas no longer line up with the calendar. Water exists, but the calendar is slipping. The wet season does not reliably recharge enough. The snow season stores less. The growing season begins with lower soil moisture. The summer heat pulls harder. The storm arrives too late or too fast. The reservoir manager waits for inflow that misses the basin. The farmer waits for irrigation allocation. The city asks residents to conserve. The river is asked to remain a river while serving as supply line, cooling system, transport corridor, ecological habitat, tourist attraction, and political boundary. The river cannot negotiate. It only falls. The history matters because Europe has been warned by recent events. The drought of 2022 shocked the continent not because drought was unknown, but because of its scale, persistence, and consequences across sectors. Rivers ran low. Heat intensified stress. Agriculture suffered. Energy systems faced constraints. Navigation on major waterways became more difficult. The event entered public memory as a warning that drought in Europe could no longer be treated as a Mediterranean problem or an agricultural side story. Then came years that complicated the picture rather than resolving it. Some regions saw floods. Some saw wetter periods. Some soils recovered temporarily. Others remained vulnerable. In 2025, Copernicus reported that Europe experienced one of the driest years for soil moisture in the satellite record, with drier-than-average conditions affecting large parts of the continent. The report described May as a month when a large share of Europe experienced agricultural drought conditions, including extreme categories. The World Meteorological Organization and Copernicus also highlighted that a large majority of European rivers had below-average annual flows in 2025. These facts do not mean every year will be drier everywhere. They mean the baseline is becoming more volatile and the system is repeatedly being tested. A scientific warning does not need every year to break a record. It only needs the frequency, intensity, timing, or spatial pattern of stress to move beyond what infrastructure and institutions were designed to handle. That is the point many viewers miss. Climate risk is not measured only by record-breaking disasters. It is measured by the gap between what happens and what the system expected. A city may survive a drought, but spend emergency money, impose restrictions, anger residents, draw down reserves, postpone maintenance, and enter the next year weaker. A farm may survive a dry season, but take on debt, lose yield, change crops, reduce labor, or abandon a field. A wetland may survive one low-flow period, but lose species gradually. A utility may maintain supply, but pump groundwater harder. Resilience can be consumed invisibly. The disaster is not always the moment the tap runs dry. Sometimes the disaster is the slow conversion of backup plans into normal operations. History also shows that water stress is rarely only natural. It is always partly social. Drought is a climate hazard, but shortage is shaped by decisions. Where cities expand, what crops are planted, how irrigation is priced, how leaks are repaired, how wastewater is reused, how wetlands are protected, how groundwater is monitored, how emergency restrictions are communicated, and how much political conflict delays adaptation. Two regions can receive similar rainfall deficits and experience different crises because one has better storage, lower leakage, healthier soils, diversified supply, stricter abstraction rules, or a culture of conservation. This is why blame cannot be placed only on the sky. The sky sets conditions. Society determines exposure. The dangerous pattern is when both move in the wrong direction. Climate makes dry periods sharper, while human systems add demand, pollution, leakage, and land use change. The European Commission's focus on restoring and protecting the water cycle from source to sea reflects this recognition. Water resilience is not only a matter of building more reservoirs or drilling deeper wells. It is a matter of keeping water in landscapes longer, allowing soils and wetlands to store it, reducing pollution, so available water remains usable, improving efficiency before expanding supply, repairing networks, reusing treated water where safe, and planning by basin rather than by political wish. But these solutions are slower, less visible, and more politically difficult than emergency restrictions. A restriction can be announced tomorrow. A healthy aquifer may take years to recover. A repaired pipe network requires investment before applause. A restored wetland does not look like a mega project, but it may slow runoff, support biodiversity, and buffer extremes. A changed irrigation system may save water, but it requires money, trust, and training. The public often sees only the crisis, not the decades of decisions that made the crisis easier or harder. The vulnerable layers are where this story becomes human. In a wealthy European city, water stress may first appear as inconvenience. Brown lawns, closed fountains, limits on car washing, higher bills, or public campaigns urging shorter showers. In a rural community, it may mean a well runs low, a small supplier struggles, or water has to be trucked in. In farming regions, it may mean choosing which crop receives irrigation and which is allowed to fail. In tourist regions, it may mean residents being asked to save water while visitors arrive in numbers that stretch local supply. In lower-income households, higher water and food prices can hit harder because there is less margin. In elderly populations, water stress can combine with heat stress because hydration, cooling, sanitation, and health services all rely on functioning water systems. In ecosystems, low flows can raise water temperature, concentrate pollutants, reduce oxygen, and push fish and invertebrates beyond tolerance. The river becomes not only lower, but more chemically and biologically stressed. Quantity and quality are joined. This is another overlooked point. A liter of water is not always usable. During drought, pollutants can become more concentrated because there is less flow to dilute them. Warmer water can worsen ecological stress. Algal blooms may become more likely in some conditions. Treatment can become harder or more expensive. The European Commission has reported that many EU surface water bodies are not in good chemical or ecological condition. That means scarcity does not occur in a clean laboratory system. It occurs in rivers and lakes, already pressured by agriculture, chemicals, urban runoff, wastewater, industry, and altered habitats. When flow declines, these pressures can become more visible. A river with less water is less able to absorb mistakes. A basin with pollution has less usable supply than its volume suggests. On paper, water quantity may look adequate. In practice, quality can remove water from the usable pool. The system does not break only when there is no water. It can break when the water that remains is too warm, too polluted, too expensive to treat, too far from demand, or legally unavailable because ecosystems also have minimum needs. The weak parts of the system are not evenly distributed. Old pipe networks lose treated water before it reaches households. Small municipalities may lack money for upgrades. Agricultural regions may depend on irrigation, infrastructure designed for a different climate. Coastal aquifers may face saltwater intrusion if pumped too hard. Mountain regions may lose snow storage. River navigation corridors may become vulnerable to low water during dry summers. Power systems may face constraints. if cooling water is limited or river temperatures rise. Hospitals and care homes depend on reliable water during heat emergencies. Data centers and new industries may add demand in places where water accounting is already fragmented. Critical mineral mining, industrial expansion, and the energy transition can create new water questions in stressed basins. None of these pressures automatically means catastrophe, but together they expose a governance problem. Europe is trying to manage 21st century water risk, with many systems built around 20th century assumptions. A central assumption was that hydrological variability could be managed with historical records. Engineers, planners, farmers, insurers, and public agencies often rely on past patterns to estimate future risk. But as warming changes, evaporation, snow, rainfall intensity, soil, moisture, and drought frequency, the past becomes a less reliable guide. This does not make planning impossible. It makes planning more demanding. It requires stress testing systems against scenarios beyond recent memory. It requires asking what happens if a dry winter is followed by a dry spring, then a heat wave, then a tourist peak, then a thunderstorm that floods streets but fails to recharge aquifers. It requires asking whether reservoirs have enough margin, whether legal allocation rules can handle simultaneous stress, whether data are real-time enough, whether groundwater use is actually monitored, whether conservation plans are trusted before panic begins, and whether the public understands that saving water during drought is not symbolic but operational. The broader system risk is that water sits underneath almost every other system. Food requires water. Energy requires water. Industry requires water. Public health requires water. Cities require water. Ecosystems require water. Transport can require navigable rivers. Tourism sells landscapes that water sustains. When water becomes unreliable, the effects do not remain inside an environmental ministry. They move through electricity prices, crop yields, food imports, insurance, local budgets, migration from rural livelihoods, ecosystem damage, political conflict, and trust in public institutions. This is why the title of the story matters. Europe's water stress looks small on paper because paper likes averages. Regional shortages tell the truth because people live in regions, not averages. A household does not drink the EU's annual renewable freshwater total. A farmer does not irrigate from a continental mean. A river basin cannot borrow rainfall from a wet region hundreds of kilometers away unless infrastructure, law, energy, politics, and ecology allow it. Water is local before it is statistical, even when rivers cross borders. Shortage is experienced at the intake, the field, the pump, the well, the treatment plant, and the tap. That local experience can conflict with national narratives. A national official may say reservoirs are within normal range. A village may know its well is failing. A climate report may say precipitation was near average. A farmer may know rain missed the planting window. A utility may say supply is secure. A river ecologist may watch fish habitat shrink. These statements can all be true. The problem is scale. Averages do not lie, but they can hide. They hide extremes by smoothing them. They hide timing by annualizing it. They hide basins inside countries. They hide vulnerable households inside population totals. They hide groundwater depletion beneath normal taps. They hide ecological stress beneath economic supply. They hide the fact that the most important water in a crisis is often not the water that exists somewhere, but the water that can be used now without damaging the future. This is the core mechanism of the crisis. The conversion of a climate anomaly into a systems failure through timing, storage, demand, and governance. To see it clearly, follow one pathway. A dry winter leaves groundwater and reservoirs below comfortable levels. A warm spring accelerates evaporation and plant growth, pulling moisture from the soil earlier. Rainfall becomes patchy. Farmers begin irrigation sooner. Rivers enter summer already low. Tourists arrive. Cities draw more. Heat waves increase demand and worsen ecological stress. Authorities delay restrictions because restrictions are unpopular and because early warnings may still sound uncertain. By the time restrictions arrive, households feel blamed, farmers feel trapped, Ecosystems have already absorbed damage, and utilities are trying to protect supply with less margin. Then a storm comes, the public sees rain, and assumes the crisis is over. But if the soil is dry and compacted, much of the rain runs off. If the storm is intense, drains overflow. If the catchment is degraded, water leaves quickly. The reservoir may gain some volume, but the aquifer remains low. The root zone recovers unevenly. The system breathes, but it does not fully heal. Then the next dry period begins from a weaker starting point. This is how drought becomes cumulative, not always through one spectacular event, but through incomplete recovery. Incomplete recovery is one of the most important phrases in the new water story. A system can withstand a shock if it has time and conditions to recover, but when shocks arrive closer together, or when the recovery season itself is disrupted, resilience declines. A forest weakened by drought becomes more vulnerable to fire and pests. A farm weakened by one poor harvest has less money to invest in efficient irrigation. A water utility spending on emergency measures has less budget for long-term upgrades. An aquifer drawn down during one dry year may not recharge before the next. A wetland, stressed repeatedly, may cross ecological thresholds. The headline may report drought in a given month. The system experiences a sequence. The difference matters. Disaster reporting often treats events as episodes. Water systems remember. Soil remembers. Debt remembers. Infrastructure remembers. Politics remembers. Sometimes by becoming more polarized. This memory is why regional shortages are more truthful than annual averages. They reveal not only where water is scarce now, but where recovery is failing. Europe's changing water risk also forces a difficult conversation about fairness. During shortage, conservation is necessary. But who is asked to conserve first? Households may be told not to water gardens while agricultural irrigation continues because food production matters. Farmers may be cut off while urban supply is protected because drinking water matters. Ecosystems may lose flow because human uses dominate, even though damaged ecosystems reduce long-term resilience. Tourism may bring money to a region while increasing water demand. Wealthier users may afford private wells, storage tanks, efficient appliances, or higher bills. Poorer users may have fewer options. Water pricing can encourage efficiency, but if designed badly, it can punish essential use. Restrictions can be scientifically justified and socially resented. This is the political edge of hydrology. Water looks like a natural resource until there is not enough of it. Then it becomes a mirror of power. Who gets to keep using it? Who is told to stop? Who pays for leaks? Who profits from water-intensive development? Who bears ecological damage? Who decides that a basin has reached its limit? These are not future philosophical questions. They are practical questions for a continent where scarcity appears seasonally across substantial territory and population. The temptation is to search for one villain: climate change, agriculture, tourism, leaks, urbanization, industry, bad governance. But the more accurate story is interaction. Climate change increases the pressure by warming the atmosphere, intensifying evaporation, altering snow and rainfall patterns, and increasing the likelihood or severity of drought in many contexts. Agriculture can intensify pressure where irrigation demand is high, or where water-intensive crops are grown in stressed basins. Tourism can intensify pressure where seasonal demand peaks during dry months. Leakage wastes treated water and undermines public trust. Urban growth adds demand and sealed surfaces that reduce infiltration. Pollution reduces usable supply. Governance delays adaptation or fails to coordinate across basins. No single factor explains every shortage. But together, they make the system less forgiving. The truth is not that every dry river is caused directly and only by climate change. The truth is that a warming climate is loading the conditions under which existing weaknesses become crises. That distinction matters for credibility. It prevents exaggeration while preserving urgency. A rigorous script must say what is known, what is likely, and what is not proven. It is known that water scarcity affects large shares of EU territory and population in at least part of the year. It is known that seasonal and basin level measures reveal stresses that annual national averages can hide. It is known that Europe has experienced severe soil moisture deficits and below-average river flows in recent climate assessments. It is known that climate change is expected to increase the frequency, intensity, and impacts of drought events in Europe. Though regional patterns vary, it is known that water quality, infrastructure leakage, land use, agricultural demand, public supply, tourism, and energy systems shape actual shortage. It is not scientifically honest to claim that every local restriction, every dry field, or every low reservoir has a single cause. Weather variability still exists. Management choices matter. Local geology matters. Demand matters. Some regions may be wetter in some seasons. Some drought impacts may be reduced by adaptation. But uncertainty is not safety. The presence of multiple causes does not make the risk smaller. It often makes it harder to manage because each cause sits in a different institution. Climate policy, farming policy, water pricing, municipal infrastructure, tourism planning, industrial permitting, pollution control, and emergency response are often handled separately, while the river integrates all of them at once. The river does not care which ministry owns the problem. It only carries the result. The phrase, new baseline, should be used carefully, but it belongs in this story. A new baseline does not mean every year is dry. It means the reference point for planning has shifted. Higher temperatures make drought more damaging by increasing atmospheric demand for water. A dry spell under hotter conditions can stress crops and soils more than the same dry spell in a cooler climate. Snow that once stored winter precipitation for summer may decline or melt earlier in mountain regions. Heavy rainfall events may become more intense, increasing flood risk without guaranteeing better groundwater recharge. Dry periods may compound with heat waves. These changes mean that infrastructure designed around older averages can become miscalibrated. Reservoir rules, irrigation rights, urban drainage, flood management, drought plans, crop choices, insurance models, and ecological flow requirements may need revision. But revision is slow. Political systems often respond after visible failure. Water systems require preparation before visible failure. That mismatch is dangerous. By the time a reservoir is visibly low, the wet season that could have refilled it may already be gone. By the time a crop shows stress, yield potential may already be lost. By the time a groundwater decline is obvious, recovery may take years. By the time a city imposes restrictions, trust may already be damaged by the perception that warnings came late. A drought plan that begins only when the public sees crisis is not a plan, it is damage control. The solutions are not mysterious, but they are demanding. Reduce leaks, improve monitoring. Price water carefully without harming basic needs. Reuse treated wastewater where safe, especially for irrigation and industrial uses. Restore wetlands and floodplains that hold water in the landscape. Protect groundwater recharge areas. Shift crops and farming practices where old patterns no longer fit. Increase soil organic matter so fields hold moisture better. Use precision irrigation where appropriate. Plan tourism growth around water limits, rather than assuming supply will follow demand. Require water assessments for new industrial projects in stressed basins. Coordinate across river basins, instead of pretending political borders define hydrology. Prepare drought restrictions in stages with clear triggers. Communicate early, honestly, and locally. Invest before emergency. These measures are less cinematic than a disaster. They are also the difference between a dry season and a crisis. Yet each solution has friction. Leak reduction costs money and disrupts streets. Reuse faces public hesitation and regulatory complexity. Wetland restoration may conflict with development. Crop shifts can threaten tradition and income. Pricing reforms can become politically explosive. Data transparency can reveal overuse by powerful sectors. Basin coordination can force regions to admit they share limits. Water resilience is not only engineering, it is governance under constraint. It is the art of making limits visible early enough that society can adapt without panic. This is why the current warnings should not be dismissed as another environmental report. Reports matter when they show the outline of future conflict before conflict dominates. The European Environment Agency's numbers tell a story that is easy to miss. Even with declines in total abstraction over the longer term, the area affected by water scarcity has not clearly disappeared. Copernicus tells another part. Soil moisture deficits can persist across large parts of Europe, affecting the root zone that agriculture depends on. The Joint Research Centre tells another. Drought can affect Central and Northern Europe, not only the familiar southern hotspots. The European Commission tells another. Water resilience now requires restoring and protecting the water cycle from source to sea. Put together, these warnings form a single sentence. Europe is not simply running out of water, Europe is running out of old assumptions. The old assumption was that water scarcity belonged elsewhere, or to a few hot months. The old assumption was that wet years reset the system. The old assumption was that national averages were enough. The old assumption was that supply could be expanded when demand grew. The old assumption was that groundwater could quietly cover deficits. The old assumption was that rivers could absorb pollution, withdrawals, heat, and engineering without losing function. The old assumption was that drought plans could wait until drought arrived. Those assumptions are being tested by a water cycle with sharper edges. The future will likely be uneven. Some places will build resilience and avoid severe disruption. Some will continue reacting late. Some will see more intense conflict between agriculture, cities, ecosystems, and industry. Some will discover that their weakest point is not rainfall, but governance. Some will learn that the cheapest water is the water not lost through leaks. Some will learn that the most valuable reservoir is healthy soil. Some will learn that restored floodplains protect against both flood and drought by slowing water down. Some will learn that a tourism economy built on summer abundance cannot ignore summer scarcity. Some will learn that technological fixes help, but cannot repeal basin limits. And some will learn too late that a tap can keep running long after the system behind it has entered danger. The image to hold is not a cracked continent. It is more unsettling because it is more ordinary. A map of Europe that still has rivers, still has rain, still has green regions, still has floods, still has snow in some mountains, still has cities glittering at night, but underneath that familiar surface, the calendar of water has shifted. The water comes hard and leaves fast. It comes north when demand is south. It comes in winter when crops need summer. It falls on sealed streets instead of open soil. It rushes through drained landscapes instead of pausing in wetlands. It remains in a report as an annual average, while a farmer watches a field fail in the quarter that matters. That is the truth regional shortages reveal. They show the fracture lines inside the average. They show that water security is not a single number but a chain, and the chain can break at the smallest link: a crop window, a pipe leak, a reservoir intake, a groundwater well, a treatment plant, a legal allocation rule, a delayed restriction, a polluted stream, a dry root zone. The event will pass. A dry season will eventually end. Rain will return somewhere. Reservoirs will refill in some basins. Restrictions will be lifted in some towns. The news cycle will move on. But the message will remain, because it is larger than one season. Europe is being asked a question that every modern society will face in some form. Can systems designed for average abundance operate in an age of regional extremes? The answer will not be found in one dramatic photograph. It will be found in whether water is kept in the land longer, whether cities repair what they lose, whether agriculture adapts before yields fail, whether tourism counts its hidden demand, whether groundwater is treated as a reserve rather than a secret overdraft, whether rivers are allowed enough flow to remain alive, and whether governments act while the problem is still a warning instead of waiting until it becomes an emergency. Europe's water stress looks small on paper, because paper can smooth a continent into a number. But people do not live on paper. They live in basins, seasons, neighborhoods, farms, islands, valleys, and floodplains. They live where the pipe either holds pressure or does not, where the well either reaches water or does not, where the soil either carries a crop through heat or does not, where a river either has enough flow to serve life or becomes a thin line asked to do too much. The frightening part is not that Europe is destined to run dry, it is that a wealthy, engineered, data-rich continent is discovering how quickly water risk appears when timing fails. And the sober hope is that this discovery arrives early enough to change the system before shortage becomes the normal language of summer. Word count: approximately 5,200.